Okay, so we're at a bit of an inflection point where I want to start shifting subjects away from or contextualizing the natural set, moving into understanding what we mean by a cultural set. And that means that this is a good point to do what we should always do, which is to go back, taking everything that we've learned in this case about open, close, rise and sink, that we've learned practically, put it in our body, what it feels like, and then bring it back to standing pole. Remember that standing pole is an organic exercise. It grows with you as your level grows, as your body understands things differently and you understand things differently intellectually. So standing itself changes in how it functions as a learning aid. But now in particular I want to come back, think about the logical model of Yiquan again, and particularly focus on this idea of the 5 elements. Now, I don't get many comments on my videos, but someone did comment saying that it was absurd to suggest that each one should have a concept such as the 5 elements, with each one being based on scientific and methods that are supposed to be straightforward, stripping away all of that old kind of superstitious stuff. And I think it's always interesting how many people in each one don't actually know what Wang Shengjai taught or what he wrote about or his thinking. For one thing, his writing is highly convoluted. It's not straightforward at all, and he constantly uses what we would now call negative dialectics, which means instead of just reasoning your way to a final conclusion, you hold in contradiction these different elements, these contradictory elements, and you kind of hold them in tension and somehow come to a kind of enlightenment from recognizing that the reality is complex and contradictory. But on the 5 elements, he begins earlier on in his life talking about these, reinterpreting the metaphor, and he gives quite a convoluted description of what each element can metaphorically be said to represent, and he regenerates them into an even more convoluted set of metaphors. So if you go, I'm not going to read it out now, but I did see that someone had posted that on the internet, and they'd said something like, this is how Wang Shengjai thinks about the 5 elements. And you've got to be very careful with, it's anyone like in the academic field, if a scholar is writing over a long period of time, you've got to recognise that their thinking evolves, and Yao Zhongzun makes this point particularly about Wang Shengjai, particularly around this issue. Because what he's trying to get at very early is the 5 elements are about movements, and he's trying to separate that from the idea, this kind of 2-person forms where someone does a punch and you do a very particular kind of block, and you're thinking of that as like, well, that's wood overcoming metal. And this is where he starts saying things like, well, it's ridiculous to think that you can just watch your opponent and decide in the moment, well, that's a metal strike and I'm going to use a wood block to counter that. So he's trying to get across that that's a silly idea. Well, he says it's a silly idea explicitly. Anyway, later on in his life, he comes back to this idea of the 5 elements, and he strips away those additional convoluted metaphors that he bolted onto them. And he says, I haven't got the exact quote here to hand, but he says pretty much this, that Xing Yiquan originally didn't have 12 animal forms, and the 5 elements referred simply to 5 kinds of dynamic force. And this is trying to get across a very simple idea that what it refers to is the way that the Kwa moves, or more simply, even more than that, open, close, rise and sink, hold the centre as our foundation of each one. And we've looked at some quotes before where Wang Shengjai explains the relationship between those things, and even those things are in contradictory relationships. So Wang Shengjai will say things like, open contains close and rise is also sink, and this kind of, again, negative dialectics way of thinking. Anyway, that's what we want to capture, that's what we want to move on to, thinking about now we've experienced in a much more dynamic way using the natural set, open, close, rise, sink. Hold the centre is a little bit more abstract, but we can come back to that. But that's the feeling that you just generally get in standing. In fact, let's just think about that now, actually, now that I've said that. Because I've been watching or reading all of this stuff on the internet about weight training. It's very interesting to see how 1920s discussions in China, which include Wang Shengjai around should you do weight training and so on, just come round and round again, because people are trying to find what actually is it, what is it that makes Chinese martial arts. And anyway, I was thinking about if you've ever had like pins and needles in your leg, and when you've sat on your leg for too long, and just the slightest movement creates this agonizing feeling throughout your whole leg, like all of your nerves just burst into this kind of agonizing pain, and it's like, oh, you've got to wait 5 minutes for it to wear off. And that intensity of feeling is nothing to do with how strong your muscles are. It's nothing to do with like the practical muscular strength, like how far you could jump up in the air or something like that. It's the tiniest movement causes all of those nerves to just inflame into that agonizing pain. And that just shows you the intensity of feeling that the nerve endings have if they can be accessed, or how you access them. In this case, by sitting on your leg, which is not, it's not entirely different to standing pole, because you very often get pins and needles. It's one of the interesting things about it that if you bear with it, it will go away. So something happens with your blood flow where, if you sit on your leg, then you're reducing the blood flow. But if you're just holding your arms up in the air and you get pins and needles, there's nothing blocking the blood flow. But why does it come back again? So obviously something happens with your capillaries or whatever, with your cells, that gets the blood flow going again. So that's absolutely fascinating how standing pole can work like that. But I wanted to use that as a partial metaphor for when you've been standing for a reasonable amount of time. And remember, you don't usually get this after 5 minutes. It takes a little bit longer than that. It takes 10 minutes just to relax. But you get that feeling all over your body, that special kind of standing feeling when the body begins to relax and then knit together. And the slightest movement, like that pins and needles feeling, but not painful like that. The slightest movement, you can feel it all over your body because the intent is linking it all together. And because of this, we can do lots of very interesting things with visualization. So we can do micro movements and get that feeling, but we can also use our visualization of movements to create that feeling in the body, because it's just so liminal. And remember, I talked about this idea, where does the idea or the mental image of something begin to then connect with the physical structure? It's like these two sliding scales that, like lying in bed, you can just visualize and think about the correct feeling even without doing it. It causes responses in the body. But when you're actually doing standing, just visualizing and thinking about the movement itself somehow connects into the physical structure, very much like when you just move when you've got pins and needles, and creates that sensation in the body. And the sensations that I'm talking about for the moment are open, close, rise and sink. So let's take a look at that. And let's begin with basics. So remember, we looked at the idea of health and combat postures, and we recalled Bo Jia Kong's words. Bo Jia Kong, one of Yao Zhongzun's students, saying that really the only difference between a health posture and a combat posture is how we use visualization. It's not really the posture itself. But remember that each one is always contradictory, because it's the visualization itself that creates, if you like, or oversees the programming of what's going on in the body. So it's the visualization that skews the posture to make it single or double weighted. So even with your feet parallel, you can skew the posture to make it single weighted, which is what we want to be more practical for fight application. And we generally begin to get that concept across by using this, what's sometimes called combat posture, basic combat posture, or Zhuang. Zhuang, my pronunciation is, I can't even pronounce pronunciation. And we've looked at all of this before, but this posture does two very important things. Firstly, it makes it much easier to generate and transmit force, and also to receive force defensively. It's structurally highly sympathetic to that. And secondly, it puts in most cases, puts at least some of the striking points of the body closer to the target. So remember that Farley takes place within the space of a Chinese inch, which is a very short space. It's like three imperial inches, something like that. So if you've got the posture skewed forward like that, at least for a strike with the lead part of your body, lead hand, lead leg, it puts the hitting limb that much closer to the target. It covers most of that distance. Half of that movement is already completed. So when we say that this posture is 70-30, we usually think of that as meaning there's 70% of the weight on the back leg, 30% of the weight on the front leg. It also has this other meaning that 70% of the movement is already complete. Say, for example, for a jab, 70% of that movement is already complete and you only need to complete the last 30%. And we can bring in a bit of Wang Xiangjai here. He says, quote, Da Cheng Chuan's breaking hands primarily focuses on equal distribution of force. And by that, he doesn't mean double weightedness. He means, the whole body unified force. And he continues, quote, followed by the application of triangular tension and then single weight exertion. And bigger quote here in a section that titled Single Weight Exertion. This is from his book on breaking hands. He says, quote, in any martial art, footwork is essential and its mastery hinges on the manipulation of the body's centre of gravity. Drawing from decades of experience in training and practical combat, the technique of utilising a 30-70 stance with single weight exertion is a pivotal factor in achieving superiority in combat. When applying force in this manner, the body and the tension must be engaged simultaneously to initiate power. The power is released when the body's tension is pulled back. This requires using intention to control the relaxation and the emptiness of the entire body. In an instant, tighten the body. By doing so, the force is transferred to the opponent's body. End quote. And that's pretty much everything that I've been sharing so far with everyone. The use of hit and stop and relaxation of Farley into the hit point and transmission of force. And then at the end of the book, in his summary, Wang Xiangjai just lists single weighted strikes as one of the essential points of Da Cheng Chuan. And remember again that idea of 30-70 stance, it partially refers to weight distribution, but that's not the whole idea behind it. Just keep that in mind. In terms of the requirements of this posture, I've looked at that before. There's a few people, Wang Xiangjai and some of his students, I was just reading this the other day, I can't remember who it was, but either Wang Xiangjai or one of his senior students saying you don't have to overly focus on the particularities of the form. So you've got some people who are like, if your finger isn't, equidistant from all the other fingers, or if you're 1 inch too low with your arm or something like that, your chi will reverse and you'll die or become impotent or something. All of that is nonsense, and Wang Xiangjai and all of his students say it doesn't actually matter if the form is absolutely perfect, but the form does change over time, and it changes across different schools, if you want to call it that, and different people. But what really matters is bao, the curvedness within the whole structure at each joint, and how that then links together and is interconnected through intent. Anyway, I'll let the great man explain this himself. So Wang Xiangjai says, and I quote, thus, the application of breaking hands must be guided by intention, anchored in formlessness and expressed through no mind. During practice, cultivate this principle daily, i.e., the joints of the entire body should contain curved forms and they should simultaneously encompass relaxation and expansion. Their function relies on mutual coordination. Forming obtuse triangular shapes and yielding within these shapes ensures that the force generated is not interrupted by a particular joint's tension. Such force is then less likely to be restrained and can be effectively directed against the opponent. End quote. And if we just go back for a moment to that thing that Wang Xiangjai says, during practice cultivate this principle daily, i.e. the joints of the entire body should contain curved forms and they should simultaneously encompass relaxation and expansion. Relaxation and expansion means open and close, i.e. expansion and contraction, the two forms in which a human body can actually generate striking force. And those in turn are just expressions of the same principle of physics, i.e. the laws around velocity and force. So that single thing becomes two things, open and close, and then open, close, as it's structured around a body that's single weighted, becomes open, close, rise and sink. And holding those two things together simultaneously, expansion and contraction, is what we call hold the centre. That feeling of holding bao, linking the whole body together, that's the fifth element. And from there, the only other postural requirements we need to remember is that the rear hand should be lower than the lead hand, but generally speaking pointing towards the lead hand. and the lead hand should be, broadly speaking, in line with your nose.